Hello and thank you for joining us on France 24. I'm Nadia Sharbi, and before we go back to our special edition on Brexit the day after, let me tell you more about our main stories this hour. From elation to resignation, a divided Britain enters the post-Brexit era, and officials in London and Brussels strap in for the next challenge. The two sides will now have to build a new economic and diplomatic relationship, with talks starting in March. In a first signal of the tug-of-war to come, the Daily Telegraph reports that Boris Johnson is preparing to impose full customs and border checks on all EU goods entering Britain starting next year. As the death toll reaches at least 259, China faces deepening isolation over its coronavirus epidemic. The US and Australia lead a growing list of nations imposing extraordinary travel bans, and airlines suspend flights to China. Among the latest, Delta Airlines says it's accelerating this process, with its last China-bound flight landing this Saturday and its last return flight taking off tomorrow. And speaking at an Arab League meeting in Cairo, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas threatens to cut all ties with both Israel and the US, including on security. The Palestinians reject the White House's controversial Middle East peace plan as heavily favouring Israel. According to the deal, Palestinians would be granted limited self-rule in parts of the occupied West Bank, while Israel would be allowed to annex all its settlements there and keep nearly all of East Jerusalem. Well, let's go now to our special edition. Now, let's start our special edition with the latest first tangible consequences of the divorce between the UK and EU. The French Agriculture Ministry says this Saturday its country's fishermen have been temporarily banned from entering the waters of Guernsey. This due to post-Brexit administrative changes. Now, while authorities say they do expect to resolve this issue in the coming days, the hold-up might be a taste of things to come, as officials are preparing for the long and high-stakes discussion over post-Brexit relations. Meanwhile, the night was a momentous one for both Brexiteers and Remainers, who marked the fateful moment in a variety of ways. Camille Delec takes a look now at those who've been celebrating what they welcome as a newfound independence for Britain.
The clock counted down the end of an era. Much to the joy of the crowd of Brexit supporters gathered in London to celebrate, and of Brexiter-in-Chief Nigel Farage.
The fact is that the war is over. We have won!
For many people here, it's not just about opposing the European Union, but about respecting the referendum result.
We all knew exactly what we were voting for, and today, democracy has been delivered in this country.
Even though the Yorkshire city of Leeds narrowly voted to remain in the 2016 referendum, the countdown there ended in fireworks and cries of freedom. And Brexit-themed parties saw the Union Jacks out in full force.
We're a strong country, and I think being out of the EU is a wonderful thing for us.
In Blackwood in South Wales, locals celebrated in that quintessential British way by going down the pub. Even in the Remain stronghold of Northern Ireland, where 56% of voters chose to stay in the European Union, the day was cause for song and celebration.
We are very proud to be British, and we want to be part of an independent nation.
But now Britain has the tough task of defining the UK's future relationship with the EU. Many details of what that could look like will be hashed out over the next 11 months.
Well, this historic moment has, of course, left the country deeply divided. Let's take a listen to a few Remainers reacting to this new normal.
Transition period is productive. We will have trade deals with the people, which are similar to what we had with the EU. If not, we will be worse off. I think we voted to be poorer, personally.
It's just not going to go well, because I think people are saying, oh, well, it ends the uncertainty. I think that it just brings more and more uncertainty, because no one really knows what's going to happen. I think recession, it's all going to end in tears.
Well, that divide is nowhere more apparent than along the border between Britain and Scotland, as over 60% of Scots voted to remain in the EU, and the possibility of a new independence referendum is now looming large. For the latest, we can cross now to our reporter, Catherine Norris-Trent, who joins us from Edinburgh. Catherine, hello, thank you for being with us. Are Scots resigned or combative in the face of Brexit this Saturday?
Well, a lot of Scottish people here in the capital, Edinburgh, are feeling combative in the wake of Brexit. We've seen groups of pro-European, pro-independence protesters outside the front of the Scottish Parliament, Holyrood, again today, a smaller number than on Brexit night. But they say they're going to keep up with their message. A lot of people here deeply disappointed and frustrated about being dragged out of the EU, they say, against their will. And this has become inextricably linked, this message now, with the push for independence. It's breathing new life, they say, into the battle to make Scotland a fully independent state, to make it break away from the rest of the UK and then try and rejoin the EU. So obviously that would be a long and complicated road, but the protesters here say they are not giving up. They feel that they've got momentum on their side. They're going to be holding several protest marches throughout this year, and they're seeming quite buoyant in the wake of Brexit so far.
How will Brexit translate for Scotland, Catherine?
So Brexit applies to Scotland in the same way that it applies to the rest of the UK, even though a majority of people here, 62% in the referendum, voted to remain in the EU. That hasn't been taken into account. It's the overall UK vote that applies. So Scotland has, as of 11 p.m. local time on Friday, left the EU. Now, a lot of people here are deeply disappointed about that and want to rejoin. That could be a long road because, as it stands, Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister in Westminster, absolutely, of course, has no intention of doing that. So a lot of Scots and Scottish National Party, the ruling party here and the party that dominates the political scene, winning 48 out of the 59 Westminster seats here at the December elections. Well, they are campaigning vociferously for an independence referendum, but that doesn't necessarily have the backing of Westminster. So Nicola Sturgeon now has a constitutional puzzle, a brick wall in front of her, because she legally cannot do anything to force Boris Johnson to give her a referendum, so she's trying to keep the pressure up. In a speech on Brexit Day morning, she disappointed quite a lot of her supporters by saying she wanted to do this legally, saying it would take some time, asking for independent supporters to be patient. She said she had to be in this for the long haul and try and work out a way of doing this legally, not at all going down the Catalonia route and calling any kind of wildcat independence referendum.
And is London making any overtures to Edinburgh in the hopes of keeping it on board?
So far, we haven't seen any overtures from London at all. The message from the government down in London is that they are working to level up the whole of the UK, but that is not playing out very well at all here in Edinburgh and across other parts of Scotland. The Conservative government is deeply unpopular here, and the man at the head of that government, Boris Johnson, is even more unpopular than the government as a whole. He kind of personifies everything a lot of Scottish people don't like about England and English people. He's seen as arrogant and elitist. People say he doesn't represent them. So he said he's going to unite the country, but he's got his work cut out to try and get Scottish people on board.
Voted 62% to remain in Europe. Why is Scotland so pro-Europe?
Now, Scots will tell you, has a long pro-European tradition, goes back to the old alliance with France. In fact, they say they've been working with European countries, including France, for longer than they've been working with the English. The union politically uniting England and Scotland only dates back around 300 years officially, of course, although there have been links, historic links, way longer than.
We appear to have lost our connection there with Catherine Norris-Trent in Edinburgh. We might go back to her a little later. Now, if you thought the drawn-out battle over the UK's departure from the EU was painful, what comes next isn't likely to be any easier. And the stakes are high for London, as Europe accounts for 54% of Britain's imports and 43% of its exports. Negotiations aimed at forging a new economic relationship between both sides are expected to start in early March, once London and Brussels have staked out their respective positions. And the process could be further complicated by the UK carrying out parallel and potentially contradictory talks with the United States. Colin Kinborough has more on some of the challenges ahead.
A new day, a new round of deadlines for deciding the European Union's future ties with the UK. Britain and the EU now have until the end of 2020 to negotiate their new relationship. In particular, a trade deal, which analysts say could be even harder to agree on than the initial withdrawal.
So there's a massive agenda to be agreed: trade in goods, trade in services, data protection, security cooperation, aviation, road haulage, fishing. The list is endless.
One fundamental challenge: product standards. Downing Street hopes to maintain zero quota, zero tariff trade across the Channel. But the EU says that would require the UK to pledge zero dumping. That is, not to lower social and environmental standards to outcompete the EU.
The more the UK diverges from EU standards, the less access to the single market it will have.
Another key sticking point: fisheries. Many British fishermen feel their waters have been plundered for decades by European rivals. Then there's Gibraltar. Thousands of Spaniards cross into the tiny British territory every day to work. Gibraltar's chief minister expressed optimism Friday that this would continue. But it all hangs in the balance of the upcoming talks. Gibraltar's challenge is a window onto a much larger one: freedom of movement between the EU and the UK. Not only has Downing Street vowed to end it for new arrivals, but questions remain for the nearly 3 million Europeans living in the UK already, and the 1.2 million Brits in the EU. Some have expressed worry that they could be used as pawns in negotiations, though the UK has already said long-time European residents will be able to stay. A loaded agenda for the talks set to begin in early March.
Well, with me in the studio, I'm joined now by our guest, Sébastien Maillard, who's director of the European think tank, the Jacques Delors Institute. Hello, thank you very much for being with us.
Hello.
As well as Nadia Massi from our International Affairs Desk. Thank you for being with us, Nadia. Let me start with you, Sébastien Maillard. What lessons can the EU, its members and also officials take away from what has been a painful process this far?
It was indeed a painful process, but what was not so painful is that the 27, as we now have 27 member states in the EU, remained together. Remember that after the referendum in June 2016, we all thought that there would be some kind of domino effect, that Netherlands perhaps would try to also go on its own way, and France also had the presidential election, and Marine Le Pen going out for a sort of Brexit, many of the other candidates as well, and nothing of that happened. On the contrary, I think Brexit wasn't very appealing and looks a bit spooky. So I think now the best lesson of Brexit is that no one wants to leave, not even Mr. Orban in Hungary or the Polish Prime Minister or Mr. Salvini in Italy. He also even wants to keep the euro. So I think Brexit has cooled down any temptation to imitate that kind of, that's the first lesson. I think the second one is that thanks to Brexit, if I may say so, the EU looked, I think it was a lesson of how the EU really works. I mean, we've been discovering through all these discussions what the single market means, what the citizenship of the EU really means. I mean, many of the Brits now are looking to become, find a way to have some Irish roots or some other roots, to find some kind of way to remain an EU citizen. The customs union also, so it was a sort of a pedagogical lesson of what the EU concretely means, and I think all this was sort of invisible or taken for granted over 47 years, and then all of a sudden, when you're about to leave, then you rediscover what it's all about. So I think the fact that the EU exists concretely and real, and the fact that the 27 remained together, show that the that EU exists. I mean, remember that we always said Brexit means Brexit. I think that's what Theresa May kept on saying. And I think through these year of discussion, we show that EU means EU. And I think that's the best lesson we can take of it.
It's an interesting point of view, this spotlight put on the EU.
Even the emotion in the
Yes, what's interesting is, but it's been a very emotional journey, hasn't it? And we've seen the reactions.
Yes, I was in Brussels yesterday, and of course I know Brussels is not like the rest of the EU. You could tell there was lots of emotion, and I think it means that leaving the EU as a member state is not like leaving, say, the OECD or the UNESCO or any kind of international organization. No, I think EU means much more to this, and I think through this painful and I think very sad and disappointing UK leaving the EU, it showed that there's more to it. It's not just rational. And I think one last lesson I think is very important is that despite all the fact that the UK, I think the Brexit is a very sad thing happening. Well, since it is happening, and it can happen without any violence, without any army entering London to keep it there. I mean, it showed that it's a big demonstration that the EU is not a prison; it's not an empire. That it's a matter of willingness. And if you don't want to be a member anymore, there is an Article 50 of the European Treaty provision that we thought it was just something theoretical, but we should now have the proof that it can happen. And I think even for the rest of the remaining countries, I think it's nice to know that you're not because you stay here. It's because you want it. It's not because you have to or you have no other choice. It's really because you want it. And I think it's a good democratic lesson. The democracy of the referendum is respected, the outcome, whether you like it or not, but also the fact that the EU is not an empire where member states are just jailed inside it. I think that makes lots of sense as well.
It's a club. People are free to come and go. That idea of, you don't know what you've got till it's gone goes both ways, Nadia, though. How much international clout has the EU lost by losing Britain?
Plenty of international clout. I mean, I do think you're absolutely right, Sebastian, that we have seen the EU unify in the past 3.5 years. We used to talk about Frexit, France exiting the European Union, Italexit, a little more clunky, but Italy leaving the European Union. We don't talk about that in the same way anymore because we have seen sort of how torturous and how difficult it is to leave the EU. And that has meant, I think, you're right, the EU has become more unified, more solid as a bloc. But let's be clear about this. Internationally, globally, the EU, of course, will be losing clout now. We're talking about the equivalent of the United States losing Texas, such as the economic power of Britain to the rest of the EU. It means the EU will be a diminished force when it comes to negotiations on climate, on trade, on security. It's losing a seat on the United Nations Security Council. Now, all of that said, though, I think when you look at some of the foreign policy decisions that Boris Johnson's government has taken since during the kind of last couple of months of the Brexit process, you can see that politically it is still trying to an extent to align itself with Europe, at least compared to the United States on issues like the Iran nuclear deal, for example, on Huawei and 5G, on climate as well. You can really see that Britain wants to say ideologically, politically, we're still not too far away from you. But yes, let's be very clear, until the very last minute, the EU was still kind of hoping Britain wasn't going to leave. That there was going to be that second referendum. The EU is Britain's largest trading partner, but that trade goes both ways, and the EU really didn't want to see this.
But that idea of aligning with Europe rather than the US perhaps rather depends on Donald Trump as well. I mean, the next US president might be more of a pull if there is a next US president and Trump isn't re-elected. They might have more of a draw for the UK, in which case the EU will be losing again.
No, definitely. I think there's a dilemma there for the British government on which side it wants to go. And of course, Brexit now can be done as it has been achieved overnight. But I mean, in which direction the UK will go, it will be very interesting to watch over this so-called transition period. And I fully agree with what Nadia has just said about the fact that EU is losing a big member. I mean, with all the respect I may have for Slovenia or Malta, or it's not just any so-called small country leaving. We're talking about a huge member leaving, and of course the single market is sort of shrinked now. We used to say that the EU is over 500 million citizens, consumers. Now it's 466. So I mean we've got under that threshold. So of course for the EU, it's a wrong signal, bad signal sent to the rest of the world that a big member is leaving. We'll be talking over the coming months also about enlargement, further enlargement, because as you know, some Western Balkan countries are knocking on the door, and I think it's interesting for the narrative also to see that the EU is still very attractive. And even we saw how the Scottish, I think, remain very have the big desire to remain in the EU in a way. But yes, we need the UK to side with us to the EU if we want a more geopolitical EU to not go the Chinese way or the American way, but do it the European way. We will definitely need the UK on our side, and I hope this period coming up will be a proof of that.
Is Europe likely to go and court the Scots? I mean, we mentioned the Scots a little earlier, Scotland wanting to remain in the EU. Is it likely to go and court them, or is it going to let that happen in its own corner before deciding what to do about it?
Well, that's really up to the Scots to do this. I mean, I think the Michel Barnier and all the other Brussels officials will never enter into this discussion as they didn't do with Catalonia or any other, because the EU is made up of member states, and you negotiate with.
This is no longer a member state.
So Scotland is not one, and so it's. But I think Brussels will prevent itself to get into that. Then, if Scotland was to become a state, then like we have like with Kosovo, for instance, well then that, and it's recognized by all the others, then that will be another story. But we're not there yet at all.
And you mentioned how Europe has been put in the spotlight, and also has come out united in a way. I mean, it's a high price to pay, but it has come out united. Is it likely to stay united in this next phase of talks?
That's the big, that's what we'll have to see in the coming months. I believe that even the closest ally of the UK, like the Netherlands, Denmark, or Ireland traditionally, for them it's important to also, and for all of us, to show that if you're not a member anymore, then it's another story, and you cannot have the best of both worlds. And I think everyone on board, for budgetary reasons, for economical reasons, for trade reasons, want this Brexit to have some meaning also, and that the UK cannot have the best of both worlds. So I think I trust that we will remain united, but it all depends on the kind of divergence the UK will want to have. The thing is that the more they diverge, and I think it was already said, the less access they will have to the single market, and so at the end of the day, it may become more painful for them, but also make the Brexit a bit more pointless, because it will be, as you rightly said, it's a big trade partner for both parties. So I tend to believe that the 27 will remain united, also because it's in the purpose of all of them, in their interest, to have a common front. We really thought that this division would have happened before, and I think we witnessed that everyone has understood that belonging to this union meant a lot.
It means a lot, but there's also been a lot of talk about the EU needing to reform. Mm-hmm. Does Britain's leaving also sort of add to the momentum on reform? Is that going to change?
Well, there's going to be this conference on the future of Europe will be launched probably on the 9th of May, and to try to see this reform needed. The policies, I think it's already happening in the sense that there's going to be a review of the competition policy of different. We see the external dimension, the geopolitical reason that the EU needs to stand up to. So it will be happening, but we will see, even with the UK leaving, it will not be easier to can make decision among the 27, because some member states would sometimes hide behind the UK, like the Netherlands or Germany on other aspect, or side with them. Now the UK will not be there to veto by itself, and others may come forward, and so I think we will discover some new attitudes in the European Council regarding this.
That'll be interesting. Now, it's easy to see this as a win for Boris Johnson. But more than that, is it not a win for Farage and the far right more broadly in Europe?
I suppose it is a win for Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party in the United Kingdom, in that patently this was the purpose of the party and Nigel Farage's political campaign for the last several decades, actually, to try and bring Britain out of the European Union. And I suspect it looked for him for a very long time like a pipe dream. You know, they didn't think that this was going to happen.
Cameron made it happen for him.
The political mobilisation changed sort of rather unexpectedly for Nigel Farage. But, you know, he's also out of a job now. We don't quite know what he's going to do. He's lost his seat in the European Parliament. But I'm sure he'll still find a way to campaign and push Boris Johnson to make sure that he gets precisely the kind of Brexit that he wants. So, yes, I think you're right. It is a win for the far right, for populism, for Nigel Farage. But I do think it's a win for Boris Johnson as well. Like, he now will be entering a kind of 11-month period where I think he's going to be able to look as if he's kind of pleasing everybody at once, just for a little bit of time, because we're in the transition period. That means economically not very much is going to change. But politically, legally, he can say, I've made that cut, and we won't have to see those difficult negotiations going on for a while. But when we start getting into those trade issues, we'll see some of the real challenges emerge, I think, for Boris Johnson, because how will he manage to provide a Brexit trade deal that simultaneously says, look, here's London as a kind of Singapore on sea, this deregulated low tax space, rival on Europe's border, something that many Brexiteers for a long time have advocated for, while simultaneously pleasing people who voted for Brexit, typically in the north of England, who want to protect industries like manufacturing, like fishing. How will he bridge both of those things at once during that trade negotiations? I think that'll be really hard for him. So yes, I think you're right. It's a win for Farage. It's a win for the far right. It's a win for Boris Johnson for now. But let's see how his political confidence is looking in a year's time as those negotiations in theory come to an end.
Nadia Massy, thank you very much. Sébastien Maillard, thank you for having been with us for this special edition. So we're leaving it for now. Stay tuned. We'll have a full news update for you at the top of the hour.